report briefing, Decoding the Emerging Workforce to Accelerate Retention, Engagement, and Profits. Today's event is sponsored by Alliant, Challenger Gray and Christmas, and Jan. In recent years, U.S. employers faced unprecedented challenges, from the upheaval of a global pandemic to the rapid evolution of remote work expectations. The game has changed. Forget business as usual. The era of an employee loyalty and static work environment is gone. Rising turnover, evolving expectations, and a turbulent market demand a bold, innovative approach to talent management. Any notion of a return to pre-2020 norms and beyond is wishful thinking. Please let me introduce our presenter today, Danny Nelms. As a nationally recognized expert in understanding the differing preferences, expectations, and intents of the American workforce, Danny has worked with and advised hundreds of companies throughout the U.S. and is an expert in helping leaders assess and identify what needs to be done to reduce turnover. Danny is a published author and a self-described recovering human resource officer. As CEO of the Work Institute, Danny has a front row seat to the evolving workforce and workplace challenges. Danny presents with facts, not popular opinions. Please welcome Danny Nelms.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Really appreciate it. Excited to be presenting to you all this morning, and let's get going. So there are plenty of people to do the work that needs to get done. They're just working somewhere else. Think about that for a couple minutes. Our owner and founder, Dr. Tom Mahan, I think I've probably heard him say this, 1,000 times or so. But it really hits home when it took me a while to figure it out. It really took me a while to kind of think about that. But there are plenty of people to do the work that needs to get done. They're just working somewhere else. So it really boils down to, I think a lot of times we believe that the workers are going to come from the ranks of the unemployed, but it really is trying to attract workers from other places that they're working. That's the key to keeping our workforce filled. Of course, first we need to figure out how are we going to retain them. And the secret sauce is that once we actually figure out how to retain our employees, we're actually going to become an attractor to other employees. And that's the thing that I think a lot of folks don't understand. So we have to first retain the people we have. And then as we do that, we're actually going to become more attractive to other folks. So I want to talk a little bit about, is it about employers or is it about employees? You know, I feel like I hear kind of every day that employers are frustrated. They're frustrated with the fact that they feel like employees are entitled. They feel like they're demanding. They feel like they want this, they want that. Everything is, employees are just wanting. And I'm sorry, but guess what? It's kind of true. And the reality is that they can. And I'm going to definitely be talking quite a bit about that this morning as we go along and talk about the employees for a few minutes. So let's talk about them. So, I mean, is it hard to find people? Sure it is. And there are definitely some external factors that are influencing our ability to attract workers. But again, it's really from other employers that we need to be attracting them, not from the unemployed, but it's a factor. So we actually do have some supply and demand issues in the US right now. So as of the end of 2023, we had a little over 9 million open jobs in the US, and we only had about 6 million unemployed. Now those numbers have sort of narrowed just a little bit over the first quarter of 2024. So instead of the 3 million gap we had in December, we're at about a 2.5 million gap. But what that means is that if every unemployed person got a job tomorrow, we'd still have like 2.5 million open jobs. So there definitely are external pressures that are going on, and competition is certainly fierce. But let's talk about these employees. Let's talk about the workforce. So way back the late 90s, early 2000s, there was an organization called the Serotonin Institute in partnership with Spherion, who was their owner, who went about looking at this concept of the emergent workforce. And there were a lot of things going on kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s that really they felt that there was this change in how workers were behaving, but also in how employers were going to need to adapt to this emergent workforce. So let's look at a couple of things. Um, Take, for example, loyalty, right? The traditional workforce really defined loyalty as tenure. How long have I been there? And this emerging workforce was really defining it more as contribution. So how much am I contributing to the organization? Traditional workers, when it came to job change, viewed it as kind of damaging to one's career, as opposed to this emerging workforce really viewed it as a vehicle for growth, right? And we're still seeing that today. Career path, it was the responsibility of the employer. Now employees really take responsibility for their career path. When it came to advancement, traditional workers really felt like it was based on length of service, whereas this emergent workforce said it's based on a level of performance. And then lastly, around job security, traditional workers really required that as a commitment, and this emergent workforce really rejected that concept. So obviously, we've had a huge shift in that late 90s. And as of about 2013 or so, 2003, Spherion estimated that about 30% of the workforce was in this emerging category. So I think we could all agree today that 100% of the workforce has certainly emerged into these set of values. But what's interesting is that now we're seeing a whole new set of preferences. And I like to use the word preferences as opposed to values, because I think it is about the preferences and expectations of workers. So let's take a look at some of these new preferences that are coming along. And I will tell you that these preferences were starting to emerge prior to the pandemic. We were starting to feel a lot of these coming along as turnover was going up, and we'll talk a little bit about more about this in a few minutes, but as that turnover was going up in the 2016, 2017, 2018 period, we were starting to see a lot of these new preferences emerge. Honestly, the pandemic was like fuel on a fire, and these preferences jumped significantly. So let's talk about a few. So the worker today requires flexibility. They are requiring flexibility in their work. And I know that for a lot of you, this is a challenge, right? So we have, according to McKinsey, about 50% of the US workforce can work some type of a hybrid work arrangement, right? So we've got the other 50% that don't have the ability. So things like healthcare workers or hospitality workers or trades workers, they don't have really the ability to do this quote remote work or hybrid work arrangement. What they can demand, though, is flexibility. And why are they requiring that flexibility? Because they're also demanding integration. And what do I mean by that? So people want to be able to integrate their life with work, right? We used to talk about this as work-life balance. And I think that's something that's now sort of going in the past. Now we don't want just balance. We want to be able to integrate our life and work. So think about some of the things that can come up, whether it's a kid's baseball game, or whether it's needing to have your car serviced, or you've got a doctor's appointment, or you've got workers coming to your house or your home, any of those kind of things. Now we want the ability to be able to work around those things that we need to do on a day in and day out basis while still getting the work done. And again, we've got these sort of two sets of workers. For someone who's doing a remote work arrangement, not quite as big a deal, although the employer has to recognize that they're going to be sort of online and offline at different times. It really comes down to those workers that don't have remote work capability, where they're demanding integration, they're demanding flexibility. So we're seeing now that Manufacturers, for example, are having to look more creatively at how they're scheduling employees and the flexibility in those schedules and how is that going to work. I was talking to somebody just the other day who mentioned that I think it was at Amazon that put an app in place where employees could easily just switch schedules with someone else. And, it used to be that had to go through three layers of approval to get done. And now it can simply be done on an app with agreement between two coworkers and somebody's taking somebody else's shift. So I think a lot of that kind of thinking is going to have to occur in order to adapt to these new preferences around this emerging workforce. There's also an expectation that employers adapt job characteristics, right? Gone are the days where the job is what the job is. Now, as employees come in, they want to play to their strengths. They want to be able to see jobs adapted and see things that they can do well in their job. So they're expecting that employers are actually going to adapt things and make it fit more with them as opposed to the other way around. And employees are expecting, as part of that, an employee first culture. It's not all about the company. It's all about employees. And we're going to talk about that down the road as well. One of the things that we saw significantly during the pandemic was this idea of care and concern. Like employees and employers, and we'll talk, I keep saying we're going to talk about a lot of things, but you have to kind of take all this in order. But certainly during the pandemic, employers were showing care and concern for employees and their family. And now it's been established as an expectation. Employees expect you to feel concern for them and for their families, and they want the autonomy to do the job, right? And this is a big one, again, and this is sort of related to some degree about these job characteristics, but it's really about sort of gone are the days of this sort of taskmaster manager who says, this is the way the job is supposed to be done. You do this first, you do this first, you do this first. Now employees are saying, what needs to get done? What is the outcome? And I'm going to figure out how I'm going to actually get that done. So they want a certain amount of autonomy. They want to work with who they want to work with. Team matters. The people that are around me matter. So that's a big part of this. And then last and maybe most important, at least to a lot of folks, people want to feel a level of occupational purpose. How does my job fulfill my work purpose? And hopefully employees can sort of tie that into the organizational purpose, but at least is this fulfilling for me? So these are a whole new set of preferences that we are now seeing in the US workforce. And what I fear is that employers are going to be very slow to adapt to that. I was recently reading an article and said that like 60% of employees would quit if offered a fully remote position. Think about that. So half the workforce, 80 million people or so, of that 40 million people would quit their job if they were offered a fully remote work position. So employers are going to have to adapt. So what about employers? So this is where, and it gets challenging, right? Because from my perspective, one of the things that we've been doing as employers is that we've sort of been managing for the last, some would say 30 years, by bestseller. We're constantly sort of chasing ideas. We're chasing thoughts. It's gone for everything from total quality to Six Sigma to, who moved my cheese to, if Harry Potter ran General Electric to, recently I saw a book come up on a list that I had that said lead like Lasso, right? So we keep sort of chasing these things and trying to figure out what are those experts over there talking about in terms of how I should manage and how I should do things in my organization. And the thing that I find that we're not doing is we're simply not listening to that most important asset, which is our people. They're going to tell us what their preferences and expectations are. And we are going to have to find ways to adapt to that. So unfortunately, with this sort of rigid approach to be as an employer, it's kind of gotten us a lot of things, right? So first of all, it's kind of gotten us here, right? We saw in the wake of the pandemic and this, what we called the Great Resignation in 2022, some almost 47, 48 million people leave their jobs voluntarily. Now think about that. We've got about 165 million people in the US workforce. So that's like 20%, 27% of the US workforce that said, nope, I'm going to go to work somewhere else, right? They're not just leaving the workforce, although we've got some, had some high levels of retirements during that time, but they're simply saying, I'm going to go work somewhere else. Now, those numbers came back down a little bit in 2023. And at least in the first quarter of this year, we're seeing those numbers continue to go down slightly. But I harken back to 2017, can't talk this morning, 2017, 2018, some 40 million people were leaving their jobs voluntarily, and everybody was concerned. The turnover was too high. It was difficult to find people. Too many people were leaving. Right now, it's as though we're going to get back to sort of that level. And I think employers are sort of breathing, right? They're saying, wow, maybe things are starting to get better, turnover starting to go down. But still, we have a massive number of people that are leaving their jobs voluntarily, and it's expensive, and we'll talk about that. There's one other thing here at the Work Institute that we do, and that is that we track core drivers of retention and engagement. And we keep things pretty simple around here. So we think about it as the company as an employer, the manager, the team or the people I work with, and the job itself, right? So here's what's been pretty, I call it fascinating because I'm a data nerd, but on the flip side, this is an alarming statistic for employers. So it turns out that during the pandemic, employers did something that I thought was impossible, and that's that they did things right? I would have guessed that employers were going to struggle during the pandemic and not do a very good job, and employees were going to really reject their behavior in the wake of the pandemic. It actually turned out the opposite was true, and people actually perceived all of those core drivers more positively during the pandemic period. And we actually saw, if you look at some other companies that are measuring employee satisfaction, employee engagement, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well, all of those numbers tended to go up. And some of us would say, well, employees felt empathy for their employers, but we look deeper into the data. And when we look deep in the data, what we find is things like manager availability was considered to be greater. Even though we were all scattered and working from home and working in away from everybody, managers were actually seen as being more available during the pandemic period. We actually saw that employers were setting clear expectations, right? And that's one of the things that employees appreciate is that when there's a clear expectation of what they need to be doing, and employers were doing a good job of that. Communication improved. A huge part of creating a great culture and retaining employees and engaging employees is communicating effectively. And because we saw that pandemic period as really a crisis, communications were ramped up. And so all of those perceptions went up. Now you can see since 2020, all four of those core drivers have continued to trend down. Now, managers have hung in there a little bit better than most, but we're actually seeing that trending down in 2023. And this really has to be alarming for employers. So clearly things need to be done differently. This new emerging workforce has different preferences and expectations, and employers are going to have to do something different in order to meet those preferences and expectations. One little side note, this is a measure of those that are employees actually reporting compliance, ethics, unethical behavior in the organization. Those numbers are actually on the rise as well. And in 2023, we saw like a 20% rise in the number of people that were reporting incidents of compliance, ethics, or unethical behavior in their organization. And we actually even went back to sort of 2017, 2018. We all know there were some social issues going on during that time around things like Me Too. The numbers are actually even higher now than they were then. So clearly employees, again, have a higher level of expectation from their employees. And there's things that they simply will not tolerate in the workplace. And we've got to be able to figure out what are those things and how are we going to change them. And lastly, all of these things that are being going on in our organizations are actually causing people to leave. And notice I said it's causing people to leave. Again, I think we actually put the onus on employees, right? Well, employees are leaving, not that employees are leaving their employer. I would contend, and we actually wrote this in our 2022 retention report, 2023, that employers caused the Great Resignation. Employers caused the Great Resignation. It was actually the things that they were doing during the pandemic that employees appreciated. There was real care and concern. And then suddenly they stopped doing those things. These preferences continued to change, and employees left in droves. They said somebody else is going to do things better than my employer is doing them. And it cost us a lot of money. In 2022, we were approaching $1 trillion in cost of turnover in the US. Think about that. $1 trillion? It cost employers a lot of money. And we need to be thinking about this cost of turnover in a business context. And I know a lot of you that are going to be listening to this webinar and that interact with us here at the Work Institute or HR professionals. And this is one of the challenges that I think we have. I think a lot of times we talk about turnover, we talk about the challenges of turnover, but we actually don't talk about how much it costs us. And I've told this story, many, many times. Some of you may have heard me talk about it, but when I was an HR leader, now that I'm a recovering HR leader, we actually had about 30% turnover in a healthcare organization that I was leading the HR function for. And I kept talking about it in our leadership meetings, and I was getting no attention. And it was actually Dr. Mahan, who founded Work Institute, that I was meeting with one day that said, well, have you figured out how much it's costing you? No. So we sat down, we used some numbers, and we, on the back of a napkin, basically figured out that our cost of turnover was somewhere around $7 million. Now, the next time I went to our executive meeting and I sat down with my team, I started with saying, hey, we have a $7 million problem. Suddenly the attitude changed around our turnover, and we started to really try and find ways to address it. So an average US worker is making somewhere between $55,000, $60,000 now. So if we take our Work Institute's conservative cost of turnover of around 33% of base pay, we actually find that it's costing about $18,000 every time an employee walks out the door. Now, are there employees that cost more? Absolutely. I think the Society for Human Resource Management says 1 or 1.5 times salary. For some employees, that is absolutely correct. For other employees that may be a little bit more unskilled workers, that number may be lower. But on average, every time someone walks out the door, it's expensive. It's just profit walking out the door. And that cost of turnover gets hidden in so many line items in the P&L, whether it's recruiters, whether it's advertising, whether it's background checks, whether it's drug screens and healthcare, if it's credentialing, onboarding, the training for onboarding, all of those things, those numbers just add up and add up and add up. And we are not addressing that cost of turnover. So what's the truth? So I think one of the things that we have to do when it comes to thinking about retention in our organization is that we have to face the truth. We have to look at the truth, right? And so one of the things that I hear all the time, and I think all of us hear all the time, is that employees leave for money, right? That's what we hear all the time. Well, I got a better offer somewhere else. I got paid more somewhere else. Everybody is leaving for money. And the reality is it's simply not true. So here at Work Institute, one of the things we do is conduct exit interviews for organizations. And we do, quite frankly, we do a lot of them. Just last year we did, I think it was a little over 23,000 exit interviews for a variety of companies across the US, different shapes and sizes, although I would say they sort of probably tend to be a little bit on the larger side, say 500 to 1,000 employees or more. But I want you to notice and I wish I had my pointer would work on a webinar because I pointed out, but look at the total rewards column. It's the third from the right. Less than 10% of employees will actually cite pay as the reason I leave. Now we're grouping total rewards, which also includes benefits, but that benefits number is less than 1%, right? So total rewards is not why people are leaving. For like 13 years running, career reasons have been the number one reason. Now we also see that those are trending down a little bit, which is good, but things like health and family tend to be trending up a little bit. In the wake of the pandemic, we saw that job reasons really start to be on the rise. And we heard about that, right? Employees are sort of searching for what am I, what is my meaning? What do I want to do? What is the type of job that I want to have, right? We saw that spike in retirement during the pandemic year. We're actually seeing management reasons go up. And this is the other narrative that we often hear. And that is that people don't leave companies, they leave managers. And I always think about that as sort of a half truth, right? In a sense, that's true. But I think when we say that, we actually think that employees leave really bad managers, like people that don't treat them well, right? And it turns out that there is a percentage of the US workers that believe that, right? So they are leaving their manager. But what is really true is that the manager, and I heard this at a conference last week, and I love this terminology because I used to talk about managers as being kind of a key element in retention. They talked about it, the speaker there talked about it as being a strategic lever. And I really like that term. The manager is a strategic lever because it turns out that the manager actually is predictive of career reasons, environment reasons, job reasons, management reasons, and work-life balance reasons, and also pay. So 6 of our 11 categories for leaving are all predicted by manager ratings. So if those manager ratings are improving, those reasons are going to go down and vice versa. So managers are a strategic lever. So we've got to be investing in our managers. But more importantly than just investing in them, we've got to be giving them data and information and training that is going to help them to address these new preferences and expectations in the workforce. Because the manager, because they're that strategic lever, they're the ones that are also going to have to be adapting to what's going on in the US workforce right now. So what do we do? Okay, so first and foremost, we've got to be getting the right data. Okay, so I think there's 3 things in terms of getting the right data that we have to absolutely do. We have to be finding out how people are perceiving our organization in the early part of their employment, 30, 60, 90 days. Typically that's done in some sort of an onboarding survey. Some organizations want to have multiple touch points, some just have a single touch point. But that is absolutely so critical because about 30% of all turnover is actually occurring in the first year. And there's lots of evidence that show that if we do a good job in onboarding, they're much more likely to stay for a long time. So that onboarding process is absolutely critical. And we need to be getting feedback from employees as to how effective we are at doing that. Secondly, we've got to be doing this annual baseline study, right? So some may call it employee satisfaction, some call it a climate assessment, some might call it employee engagement. Whatever we're doing and whatever we're calling it, I don't really care, although I'm going to talk a little bit about the measurement in just a minute. We need to be measuring how employees are perceiving us as an employer from year to year. And we need to be looking to improve on that year after year after year. We need to be improving how employees are perceiving us as an employer. And then lastly, we need to be doing exit interviews. Now, I said earlier that when I showed you those themes of why people are leaving, I don't think I said this, but I truly believe that that data set from Work Institute is the most comprehensive and, quite frankly, the most realistic view of why people are leaving. And you say, well, why do you think that, Danny? Well, 2 things. 2 things have been shown to really affect whether people are honest and authentic in their exit interview. Number 1 is timing. It actually turns out that if people are doing an exit interview after they've left the company, they will actually be more honest about their reasons for leaving. And it's also that if they're talking to an outside third party, they're also going to be more honest. Turns out some 40 to 60% of the reasons for leaving will actually be different if we're doing them 2 weeks after they've left and with an outside third party. So a lot of this data that I see talking about pay is often coming from exit interviews that are done on or before their last day of employment. And let's face it, it's the easy thing for an employee to say, yeah, I got a better job offer. Well, almost everybody ends up getting a little bit more money when they leave a job and go to another job. So it's the easy answer. We've got to be able to get beyond the easy answer and get to the truth. Why is it truly that people are leaving to go to work somewhere else? Now, we can use things like stay interviews. I really like the idea of managers and employees having really high quality conversations. I do think managers should be trained. But if we're having high turnover, an outside third party can actually be conducting stay interviews that I think are highly effective. Pulse surveys can be super important. And our recruitment studies, or what we might call candidate experience, are also something that can be used. I think of those as being a little more situational, supplemental, but it's really those three core times in the employee life cycle that I think we need to be talking to them, right? Once a year, every employee needs to have an opportunity to provide feedback. We need to be talking to folks in their onboarding stage, and we need to be talking to folks after they leave. Secondly, we've got to understand the data. And this is where I think employers are potentially failing at the greatest level. I think we don't really know how to analyze our data, and we don't know how to interpret our data. And most importantly, we don't hold ourselves to a high enough standard. So most survey data that I see, the questions, vast majority of surveys are done with a 5-point Likert scale. And then for whatever reason, we actually say that those that strongly agree or rate something as excellent or agree or rate something as very good are favorable. And we feel like that's good. We're happy about that. I've gone to many companies where they'll say, well, 86% of my employees provide a favorable rating for the organization as an employer. Well, it turns out that those favorable ratings have very weak correlations to intent to stay for a long time. Weak correlations, meaning those neutral ratings, those agree ratings, those are just passive neutral ratings. Even though somebody's saying I agree, that can change really anytime. And so we really got to be holding ourselves accountable for strong agreement, excellent ratings. And I hear this all the time. We expect that when we're talking about safety, when we're talking about customer service, everything is about excellent. But when we start to talk about our employee experience, we tend to think that favorable is okay. But it does turn out that those positive ratings, those excellent and strongly agree ratings, actually have a very strong correlation to intent to stay for a long time. So those organizations that are pushing for excellent ratings, pushing for strongly agreeing, measuring those and making sure that we're improving from year to year are actually doing much better and are actually seeing turnover be less. So we've got to be holding ourselves to a much higher standard. Next, we got to act on the data. And I want to talk about this in sort of two separate kind of instances or two different processes, right? So I think it's some 70 to 80% of all companies actually do some type of annual baseline study. Okay, that's what the data tells us. And when we do that, there's a pretty typical process that at least on paper we're following, right? So we actually communicate that we're going to be doing a survey, then we deploy the survey, then we get all the survey data back. We actually analyze that data. Hopefully we're expecting excellent and strongly agrees. And then there's some sort of an action planning process where we're expecting our managers to identify actions that they're going to take to improve things, and we go from there. Now, It turns out that we don't do a great job of going through that entire process. And I hear all the time, employees from other companies will say, well, I do the survey every year, but I never hear anything and nothing ever changes. So a lot of companies aren't doing that, but there's at least the idea that that should be happening. When it comes to retention action planning, it's actually a little bit more ongoing. It's not that one time a year. It's more quarterly or twice a year. And where I think we have to be focusing is where we actually have high turnover, right? It's much more difficult to do a enterprise approach to employee turnover. We really have to look where we've got the biggest challenges. So inevitably, it's almost like the 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of all the turnover is typically happening in 20% of our facilities or 20% of our departments or in 20% of our job titles. So though in that case, we need to be focusing much more intently on a specific area. And then we walk through the same process. Here's the key missing part from my perspective and from Work Institute's perspective is we don't treat it like a project. We don't project manage it. It's actually one of the things that we do here at Work Institute, and I think we do it really well, is to help organizations to project manage their action planning. Making sure that there's some accountability, making sure that there's follow-up, making sure that organizations, managers, companies are doing what they're saying they're going to do. Let's face it, we're busy. HR people in particular are extremely busy. Middle managers are busy. Sometimes you just need an extra set of hands, and they don't need this additional responsibility thrown on them every 6 months or every year. So sometimes going and getting a little help in this instance, I think, can be extremely beneficial. And then we've got to evaluate results, right? So again, I mentioned on that baseline survey or those exit interviews, we got to be looking for improving ratings for reasons for leaving. They need to be changing from more controllable to less controllable reasons for leaving. We can't rely on external benchmarks. We've got to be very sorry about that typo there, I can see. We cannot rely on external benchmarks. Yes, they're interesting. Yes, they can sometimes help us to get action going because we're, maybe our turnover is higher than the external benchmark or our ratings are lower than the external benchmark. And if it helps get the organization moving, I'm all for it. But unfortunately, what most organizations say is as long as they are equal to or better than the external benchmark, they're not going to do anything. And that's where the mistake comes in. First of all, where did those external benchmarks come from? Because they might have come from a bunch of not very good companies. And lastly, if that's the way every company looks at it, we're going to all end up very average, very mediocre, because that's ultimately what benchmarking does. We've got to look at our internal benchmark. How do we get better from year to year, quarter to quarter, trended over time? How do we continue to improve? And we can actually use pulse surveys to see if some of those improvement interventions that we've done are actually having an impact on the workforce. Is turnover going down? Is intent to stay increasing? That's what it's all about as it relates to evaluating actual results. Just for a minute, I want to talk about employee engagement. So we haven't traditionally addressed employee engagement in our annual retention report, but I feel like it's a topic that needs to be addressed. I think it's something that, quite frankly, is broken. And I think we've got to look at it a different way. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to stop trying to measure engagement. I know that sounds so counterintuitive, but think about it for a minute. How do we even define employee engagement, right? It's an idea. It's a construct. It's a state of mind, right? And I'm simply, and the evidence really supports this, is that there are no perfect questions in order to measure engagement. And it's like no outside consultant actually can agree on what the definition is. Generally, we think about it as someone who's going to provide some level of discretionary effort, but is that what we should expect? Because that makes me feel like somebody that's going to go above and beyond, when we really should just expect them to be doing their job and doing it well and being engaged in the work that they're doing. Again, we focus too much on those bogus benchmarks. We've got to stop focusing on the benchmarks, relying on others' best practices, right? If I were to Google how to engage employees, I'm going to get, here are the 10 best practices for driving employee engagement. Do I think those are bad things to do in an organization? Not necessarily. Do I know that they're going to work in your organization? No, I don't know that, because your organization is different than this organization is different than this organization. We all bring different geographies, different employees, different leadership, different products and services. All of those things are different, and we can't expect everybody else's best practices to work. Obviously, I think a lot of times we're asking the wrong questions because, again, the wrong questions are trying to measure engagement. I don't think it can be measured. We're not using qualitative data enough. And with AI now, that's really something that's improving, is our ability to use qualitative data and be able to really interpret it quickly. And again, we're misinterpreting our survey results because we're not holding ourselves to a high enough standard related to excellent and strongly agree. So what we have to do is we have to start creating the conditions where employee engagement is most likely to occur. That's really the simple approach, right? We as an employer have to understand the preferences, expectations, intents of our workers to create those conditions. Create the conditions where they're going to be most likely to be engaged, and they're actually going to stay for a long time. We actually wrote a book about this a few years ago. Note to self, don't write and publish a book a month before a global pandemic, because I don't know if very many people have seen the book. They were much more worried about a pandemic, which I understand. But we've actually wrote the book. You can grab it on Amazon if you'd like. So again, I think because of what we're doing in the employee engagement world, this is kind of what it's getting us, right? So this is actually Gallup. Gallup's a good company. They do a lot of good work, but what they would say is some 32% or so of the US workforce is engaged. Now notice that little bump back there in 2020, 2022, 21, I guess it was, which I talked about earlier, where we saw during the pandemic, it went up a little bit, but now it's trending down. So they would say some 32% of the US workforce is engaged. Quantum Workplace says 77%. Think about that for a minute. So these are two really large companies that do a lot of surveys in the US, and yet one company is saying more than twice as many as the other are actually the number of people engaged in the US workforce. I don't get it, right? I don't understand this. The only thing that I can come up with is the fact that, quite frankly, and I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on them a little bit. Gallup does a lot of leadership development. Maybe they're trying to drive their leadership development practice by saying that less people are engaged. Quantum Workplace certifies best places to work. So they have they have a lot of reasons to want that engagement number to be higher. I don't know. I don't know what their approach is. All I know is this doesn't make any sense, that there is such a difference between two companies and the percentage of people that they say are engaged. So for me, again, I try and keep things simple. And for me, it's kind of like going back to the future. So some of you have heard of the value profit chain or the service profit chain. This work actually started way back in the early 70s, I believe, with Sears and Roebuck, a company that we're not very familiar with today, where they started to look at that correlation between customer satisfaction and customer loyalty and employee satisfaction. And I simply think we've gotten away from this. I think I hear too often, well, the customer comes first. The customer comes first. There was a guy named Hal Rosenbluth, who I worked with for a short period of time, who wrote a great book called The Customer Comes Second. And it really boils down to that. We have to understand those preferences, those expectations and intents of our workforce to improve our working conditions, to improve the likelihood that our employees are going to be engaged and they're going to stay for a long time. Because if we do that, we are going to see higher retention. We're going to see higher productivity. We're going to see higher customer satisfaction and loyalty. And ultimately, that's going to translate maybe to increased revenue, But certainly as we see retention improving, we're going to see that profitability number increase. So this is really where I think we've got to start focusing, especially for your UHR leaders. I really encourage you to go back and look at sort of service profit chain. So what are you going to do? So here's my thoughts, right? Well, first of all, I'd love for you to read our Work Institute 2024 retention report. I think there is a lot of really, really great data there. I think there's a lot of great insights. We certainly couldn't get into them all today, but there's a lot of information there that I think can really be helpful to you. Get the right data, establish a baseline, improve on that baseline. Exit interviews, onboarding surveys, the annual survey, all critical pillars in our employee listening strategy. We've got to be listening to our employees. They're going to tell us what their preferences and expectations are, and they're going to give us an opportunity to adapt. Analyze your data to know what's going on in your organization related to retention and engagement. Hold yourself to a higher standard. We've got to make sure that we're doing what's necessary to retain our employees, to engage our employees. And that requires acting on the data. Treat it like a project. Go get help. Again, it's something that we do a lot of here at Work Institute. We'd love to help some of you. You need an extra set of hands. You're busy. There's a lot going on. And I can assure you that you're going to see better results if you're actually treating your action planning process like a project. Okay. So I hope this has been helpful today. I really appreciate all of you joining it. And look forward to hopefully meeting a few of you down the road. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Kelly to close things out. Kelly?
Thank you, everybody. Just a quick reminder that the data that we presented today is not your company's data. The problems the popular press claim to solve might not be the problems you're dealing with. Remember, it's benchmark versus baseline. Let's not strive for the industry average or better than average. Let's strive for greatness. For over 20 years, the Work Institute has been the premier expert in helping employers and managers, not HR, helping employers and managers with employee retention, with keeping their people engaged, and helping employers grow their leaders for tomorrow. Understand your company's baseline and continuously compare before and after interventions. Remember, assess, diagnose, treat, evaluate, and do it again. For over 20 years, hundreds of organizations partner with the Work Institute. Let us help you through the turnover issues and engagement struggles you are facing. Let us be your listening department.